Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Global Logistics and Supply Chain Practice Head for Morgan Phillips Executive Search. Specializing in board level and executive recruitment across the region, my job is also to connect you with global experts, thought leaders and executives in all things supply chain. This is episode 15 and I'm very happy to have with us today Dr. John Gattorna. John is the executive chairman of Sydney-based specialist advisory business, Gattorna Alignment, and he is one of the most respected supply chain thought leaders globally. He has spent a lifetime working in and around enterprise supply chains in many different capacities: line executive, researcher, consultant, teacher, mentor, and author. He is passionate about the subject, some might even say obsessive. In the late 1980s, John became disenchanted with the lack of conceptual depth in the logistics field. And as it turned out, this did not improve much as logistics thinking morphed into supply chains in the 1990s. So he started to search for a new model that would better inform the design and operation of enterprise supply chains, seeking to satisfy customers and consumers at the appropriate cost to serve. And then he found dynamic alignment. So for the last 2 decades, John has been working with major blue chip corporations around the world to take his new model from the conceptual stage to a final level of granularity. Companies such as Dell, Unilever, Taze Australia, Schneider Electric. It has been a complex task involving learning about and combining several disparate disciplines: consumer, customer behavior, internal cultural capability of the enterprise, leadership styles, and of course, the operational aspects of corporate logistic networks and supply chains. The unique quality about John's perspective is that he presents a multidisciplinary, whole-of-business approach to the design and management of enterprise supply chains, and this requires, of course, an eclectic mindset. He has written several books along the way as his thinking has evolved, but his 3 most recent titles have been Living Supply Chains, Dynamic Supply Chain Alignment, and Dynamic Supply Chains, How to Design, Build and Manage People-Centric Value Networks. Another book is in the works, due mid-2020. Also, just as a final reminder, John also has a strong academic pedigree, having taught undergraduate, postgraduate and executive programs at the University of New South Wales, Macquarie University in Sydney, Oxford and Cranfield Universities in the UK, and Normandy Business School in Le Havre, France. He currently holds adjunct professorships at Cranfield School of Management and Macquarie Graduate School of Management, and is chairman of the advisory board at the Logistics of Institute and Supply Chain Management, Victoria University, Melbourne. He also teaches as the communication program at Normandy Business School, Le Havre, France. John, welcome, and it is our pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Radu. Pleasure to be here.
So, to talk a little bit about the industry side, and I think it's very important, and a lot of our listeners are very curious to find out more about the Gattorna Dynamic Alignment, which is basically your concept. Is something that you have developed and fine-tuned over time. Tell us a little bit, about it, how you came up with it, and the history.
Right. Well, when I came back from England in the early 80s to Australia, I went back into an academic job, but soon got fed up with that and started my own boutique consultancy. And what I was determined to do is really try to build some conceptual strength, if you like, around what was a very operational field at the time. And I was joined by another colleague with a PhD. His PhD was in, actually he'd been studying the correlation between culture and how much culture played into the delivery of strategy. I, from my own strengths, had coming out of Cranfield, had been very strong looking at logistics, but very much from a marketing perspective, looking at it from the customer end. And we were both interested in leadership. And literally there was a bit of serendipity involved, but we came up with this concept called, well, at the time we called it strategic alignment. We later on changed the name to dynamic alignment because we realised that the marketplace was a moving feast. But in those days, strategic alignment essentially meant if you want to perform well or you want to make money, you have to line 4 things up. And it's an enterprise concept. It's not a supply chain concept. So what we did is we went wide and we started to think about the whole enterprise. And then from that, once we got into it and we started to, at the marketplace, we realised that it gave us the answer to the question, if one size fits all isn't right, how many supply chains you need. But just going back a bit, so the alignment idea was if you want to make money, you want to perform well, you have to line 4 things up. You have to understand the expectations of your customers in the target market. You then look at that and develop your value propositions. Then underneath that, you look at your organisation design, and what it means is that if you've got multiple segments, you probably need multiple subcultures in the business, and finally you need leadership. So the way it works is that a good leadership team will look at the marketplace and have a really good understanding of what that marketplace is expecting of your company. They will then develop the appropriate operational strategies, and they'll then work down and develop the appropriate internal capabilities, including organisation design and things like that, processes, etc. So that's the top end. Of course, there is a reverse end to this, which we then later on extended, where we went right backwards into the source markets. And we said, well, if this applies to sales markets, why wouldn't it apply to source markets? And what we did, we were the first people to really introduce the notion that in the supply base, they're human. So everything that applies, amongst customers applies to the supply base. And we went and we segmented the supply base as well. And we said, we need procurement strategies which take into account, whether a supplier is loyal, whether a supplier has a low cost structure that can come up with a big volume of product in the first order, whether the supplier has the capacity to quickly respond to a replenishment order, these sorts of things. In other words, we went beyond the sort of traditional A.T. Kearney and Accenture approach, which was let's do a strategic sourcing analysis and let's rationalise the supply base and let's rationalise the product range. And yes, that does give you some dollars, but it doesn't tell you anything more about the way your supply base is wanting to interact with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a very short sort of history of it.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, you've been working for that for the last 25 years.
Yeah.
So thank you for the summary. And also, as far as I know, you were one of the pioneers who coined and contributed to the term of 4PL. Maybe if you can tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, look, I can't claim to be there on day one. What happened was that Anderson Consulting approached me in 1994 and wanted to have me join the company because they wanted to start a supply chain practice in Asia Pacific. They already had one in the US and in Europe. And during the course of about 12 months, we discussed, and then finally I rolled my business into theirs and joined Anderson Consulting in 1995 and became part of their global supply chain consulting practice, which was a very big practice. Now, at that time, they had just done some research in Europe, and they'd had some discussions in the US, and a partner called Bob Evans, who recently came out of Caterpillar, actually, I think was the first one who actually coined the phrase 4PL, but I wasn't far behind him in the sense that Bob was a colleague and other partners in the global supply chain practice at Anderson became very enthusiastic about this whole 4PL structure because we saw it as a way of overcoming a lot of the, the weaknesses of then perceived weaknesses that the 3PLs were suffering. And we knew this because we'd done market research amongst their clients, and we found about 2/3 of the market base for 3PLs around the world were dissatisfied with their performance. And it was from there we started to build, and of course, Anderson then became Accenture, and we had a number of fairly successful 4PLs around the world. However, I'd have to say that the 4PL, the original concept, was pretty rigorous, and a lot of companies jumped on the bandwagon, and 3PLs just changed the name on the door, and they didn't really
usually do, right?
Yeah, and they didn't really appreciate what we were talking about. And I had people calling me and saying me, can we do a tender for a 4PL? And I said, no, well, it's actually a consortium. And so when I left Accenture and retired and went off to start my own thought leadership business, I must admit I looked for ways of modifying the 4PL, making it a lot more flexible, more user-friendly, and came up with what I call the Joint Services Company, JSC, which is the same concept, but it was more about how you plug and play different members of the consortium if they're not performing or if something becomes obsolete and you need a new. And so that sort of new age for PLB is something I've been pushing ever since.
Got it. And obviously now it has caught up definitely, and a lot of people are talking about it and using it. And tell us a little bit about some of the most successful projects you've been involved with your clients. I mean, we mentioned, of course, you did work with Unilever, you did work with Dell, Schneider Electric. I mean, what made it successful? What can our listeners learn from it?
Look, again, it's the wonderful thing about this alignment idea is when we did the work, particularly we started in the marketplace and we went out and used behavioural segmentation techniques, and we found that across a whole range of different industries that there are 16 different types of buying behaviour that we could identify, archetypes that we could identify in the marketplace, which accords very well with the Myers-Briggs framework as well. And no surprise, because Myers-Briggs is based on Jungian psychology, and of course our work was as well. So, but that was too many, and we kept looking and trying to make our understanding of what's going on in the marketplace more granular, and try to look for the more dominant different sets of behaviours. And we actually got the number down to 4. And we subsequently went back to 5 a few years ago when we discovered that the projects marketplace, the construction marketplace, and the supply chains that service them had been going on for thousands of years in an informal way, but hadn't been properly formalised, and we coined the phrase campaign supply chain for that. But essentially, we came back down to a small number. And really, I started writing about that, probably in 1997, I think, but the first book called Living Supply Chains I put out describing this in great detail came out in 2006. And it was around about that time that Anna Clayton, who was at Dell at the time, picked up my book and made contact, and we gave her some advice there and to how to architect the supply chains there. She subsequently then moved to Schneider Electric about 2012, and that's a big company, very complex structure, many SKUs, and again I met up with Annette, and we spent about 4 years working with them and around the world, first initially in the Pacific, then in China, then in South America, North America, and about the only place we didn't go was into Europe. And really, that was probably one of those things that was very successful, because it allowed us to really use pretty much our full methodology. We did the segmentation in each marketplace, which we found similar segments but slightly different because of the different country cultures in different places. That modifies the company culture, if you know what I mean. But the broad segments were the same, and we were able to develop a global supply chain strategy, which just varied a little bit in terms of tweaking it from region to region, place to place. The results differed. In a place like Asia Pacific, where the cost was very high, and the rehandling and shipping and everything, the sorts of numbers when we put the segmentation and tested out different scenarios from the segmentation using a network model, and the two have to go together, we found that we were seeing reductions or scenarios that could give us up to 20% reduction in logistics costs as a percentage of sales. Now, obviously, you have to roll that out over a period of years and implement it. And there was some, there were some really interesting lessons learned about how to, once you've got the blueprint, how to start rolling out, that blueprint. We've done some very. That particular one, we didn't actually look at the supply base. It's something I tried to convince Annette about, but they spend about 12 billion euros on their supply side. I think they're still very traditional, and they haven't changed. However, around about the same time, we did a piece of work for a big grain company in Australia called the CBH. And it was a cooperative, and it was a very interesting cooperative because it was based in Western Australia. It had 10,000 farms, about 5,000 farmers, who generated a grain crop of about anywhere between 10 and 15 million tonnes a year. And that crop had to be taken off from the 10,000 farms and then moved through a network with trains and into silos and out of silos and then into 4 ports and then shipped out in 200,000 tonne type grain carriers. And what we're able to do there, again, using having a great client who allowed us to do this, we did the segmentation on the front end, and they only had 75 customers worldwide because these were big customers who bought 100,000 tonnes of grain at a time, or a flour mill in Thailand or something like that. At the back end, they had 5,000 farms, 10,000 farmers, 10,000 farms, 5,000 farmers, and we geocoded that, and we really did a segmentation there, and then we fed that from both ends into a model. And again, we found that we saved them in the first year between 15 and 20%. And they then had to roll out that implementation, which meant closing nearly half their silos and building new silos in different places, changing the way they routed the wheat, changing the way the wheat was taken off and which locations they went to. So that was the complete one. But going back even further, before I wrote these books, we did a piece of work in Scotland for General Accident back in about 1995, when we really were in the early days. And I give you this example because it's a service example where General Accident in the UK, in Scotland, in Perth, Scotland, had a very bad year. They'd lost a lot of money. They changed
what type of service?
General Accident. It was an insurance company.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
They had both general insurance and life insurance in Scotland. Had 10,000 people, and they'd had a bad year, lost a lot of money. So they changed chief executives, and they gave the job to a New Zealander who happened to run the office in Australia, who knew my work, and so he asked us to go to, and we went over to General Accident in Scotland over a period. We spent 3 or 4 trips over there in the space of about a year, and guiding him, we actually revamped their marketplace, their strategies, their operating plan. We did a culture map of the organisation of 10,000 people, and he changed their leadership team. And in the course of 3 years, they went from something like £250 million loss to £250 million profit. So it was a £500 million turnaround due to the alignment idea, but also due to a relentless discipline that Bob Scott applied to the task of following through. And a lot of the credit is due to him, but he needed the framework actually guide him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've had some big successes.
Yes. No, and thank you for sharing, because also I think the interesting fact is, and you've shared 3 different examples from very varied, right? So one is industrial, Schneider Electric, obviously a mammoth in the industrial space. One is on the farm agriculture side. One is on the services side, which kind of just come to show that basically it boils down to principles, right? So I mean, one of the principles, I think I heard you speak a lot, and a lot of people know this about you. You speak about segmentation. Really get your segmentation right. Make sure that you know who your clients are, and make sure that you know who's your high-yielding clients versus who are your maybe clients that are a pain in,
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at their mindset, and that's what's not taught in university. It's a big frustration of mine that we, in our courses, in master's courses, in MScs, in logistics, and even on MBAs, we do teach students about psychology, but we don't connect it to anything. We don't apply that psychology and talk about internal culture and how it applies to delivering on plans, or how the same sort of idea of culture in the mindset of a customer can be measured, and how you can group people based on similar mindsets rather than grouping them on whether they're from they work for a wholesaler or they work for an institutional type, or whether the client is big or small, or whether the client is small or large. Those things are our ways. It's an internal way of describing the customer. Mm-hmm. What we've got to do is find external ways to describe the customer. Outside-in thinking.
Yes. And I mean, it's almost like the Pareto principle. It's almost like you got to prioritize you cannot be guessing, and I heard you say that a lot, right?
We've been guessing for a long time.
A lot of people are guessing, and they don't know for sure who's my most profitable client. Who should I put my eggs in? Which basket? Where should I put my eggs? Right. So
we did. I mean, just on that point, we did some work for Fonterra, and they were another big client early on, around about 1998, when we were still trying to prove the concept. And we did a global piece of work with them. We didn't build a network model, but we did a segmentation across the 100 countries that Fonterra. They're the biggest dairy export ingredients.
They're the biggest associates of farmers in the world.
They're huge. Yes. They're huge, and they're the biggest, number one, I think, dairy exporter. They export about 2 million tons of dry ingredients. But when we did the work, and we found, they had about 3,500 customers around the world, because it's a business-to-business thing. They dealt with, some of their competitors were their customers, like Nestle and people like that. But the fascinating thing was that we found that they had a bunch of very, what I call collaborative customers, and they didn't even know who they were. And what was happening was, consequently, you'd have a collaborative customer placing an order and, 18-month type forecast. And then at the short term, you'd have an agile demanding customer come in yesterday and demand something for next week. And someone in the company would say yes, and they'd steal from Peter to pay Paul. And then when that loyal customer came in to get their regular schedule, which they'd forecast for 18 months, it wasn't there. And people were running around, running the plants.
Scrambling, basically.
It was just everything goes pear-shaped when you get into that sort of scramble state of mind.
Yes. And I think this is and I would have, one of my questions that I wanted to ask you is, like, when you start working on an assignment, what are the top 3 things that you would ask the client, to quickly identify the root issue? And it sounds to me like the segmentation is probably one of the.
It's you ask them, have they got a segmentation, and they always say yes, of course, because no respectable company hasn't got one. But then you say, well, how do you segment? And you find that they're not using the segmentation that's of any value at all to supply chain design. It might be useful for tracking the number of beer sales that you make and whether you sold more beer to clubs than you sold to distributors or hotels. But that's virtually no value when you're wanting to invest big dollars in revamping your network. So our first question is, give us a look at your current marketplace. If you haven't got it segmented right, let's segment it right. And the second question is, give us a look at your demand data, the sales data, because what we like to look at is do some analytics on the demand data to see, is there an underlying base load for your product, and is there some volatility, and can we separate the two, because that gives us a clue as to what we might have to do differently inside the company. So it's always about using external sources as a frame of reference to inform the way that we work internally on our processes, our technology combinations, our training and development, our recruitment, anything at all that that building capabilities internally. As I said, this morning at LunchSim, we've got to be informed about it from our frame of reference. If we don't have a frame of reference, we're guessing.
Yes. And you work with a lot of big multinationals worldwide. Are there certain, I think you've touched upon it, obviously, the fact that some of them have segmentations, but they're not tracking the right thing.
Yep.
Any other common challenges that they tend to have, and are also there specific differences in each country?
Look, the interesting thing about supply chain and working with different companies across industries, they all tell you how different they are and how special they are, right? But the flow of goods and information and finance through any company is the common factor. And even if you're a service company, it is the flow of information, and that's electronic rather than physical. So I look at supply chain and the operations side of the supply chain, logistics, as a sort of a common language, if you like, that we can speak in any company or any industry. It doesn't matter where we are.
Yes.
And that gives us a great start, because when you're at the centre of this and you look at a dairy company one year and a third-party logistics company another, and you look at a FMCG company like Unilever, which we did in another case, and you can start to bring some lessons from different sorts of industries and cross-pollinate. And if you can't see that, the commonalities, you can't do that sort of cross-pollination.
Yes. And it's so helpful, right? I mean, and a lot of times, we all like to think, and companies like to think we're special, and we as individuals like to think we're special, but there's some commonalities, of course. A question from Marco Antonio Carreno. I think he's actually one of our close listeners. What are some of the most advanced tools we can use in supply chain management in order to have visibility of the future and minimize risks while moving forward?
Yeah. Look, and is he talking FMCG or is he just...
I think he's from an FMCG perspective, yes.
Yeah. I mean, FMCG companies have been probably doing pretty well, probably up till the time we started to see electronic high-tech companies coming in who started with a blank sheet of paper, and that was a big advantage because they could more or less architect what they like. I think the big risk today facing these companies, like the better companies like FMCG or retail, is what I would call clock speed. I think that the speed of change in the outside world, which is creating disruption and volatility, if it's faster than we can respond internally, there becomes a real disruption factor. And it doesn't matter what you do, you're always on the back foot, you're always reacting. What I'm saying is, and I've revisited the work of Charles Fine about 20 years ago when he introduced the notion of clock speed, but didn't really have all the digitisation to go with it. I'm thinking today that the entire enterprise has to look at itself again. And look at itself from the lean point of view. How can we get rid of redundant processes? How can we bring in technologies that will speed up our decision making? Anything that can speed up the revolutions that and I use that term revolutions like as in revolving. If you can speed up the whole way that an organisation operates, I think there's other terms for it, the rhythm of the organisation. So, the best example I have is Zara, where, everyone in that organisation every day is thinking about what can I do to speed up what I'm doing. And that comes from the top down to every layer of management. And as a result, they get a product out the door, a new launch every 3 weeks, which means 16 or 17 revolutions a year. Compare that to someone like a Marks and Spencer's who might take 18 months because or it'd take 12 months to order something and then they get it in, they find the colours wrong, they've got to mark it down. That's a revolution of one, right? So you can see that the faster the enterprise can move and revolve, and the rhythm, it's got to be a rhythm because you can't go 100 miles an hour because that's expensive. I'm talking about everyone doing everything faster on a regular basis, the way they make decisions. Yes, it involves taking a bit of risk in decision-making sometimes, but I think we need people inside the business who are prepared to do that, because if you want everything done by committee, that's going to slow you down.
Yes.
So all these processes can be looked at to speed up, and if you speed up, you can, I believe, and we're in the process of proving that, is that you can get on this, if you can get your rate of change internally up to match the rate of change externally, you have no differential, therefore you don't see there's no disruption, if you like. And you don't need forecasting accuracy because you're only 3 weeks away from your last launch. So things like forecast accuracy go away. You just need good decision-making tools to help you make the big decisions.
And almost, I mean, if I can, I can take some of the sharing. It's almost like the tools are important, of course, and the technologies are important. Visibility is important, good data is important, but even more so than that is the culture. It's almost the culture of the organization. Like you gave a very good example with Zara, which is probably one of the top supply chains in the world, where everybody is living constantly in this framework of, how can we innovate? How can we speed up? How can we be better, faster, more agile in terms of what we are doing? And they are really living it, right?
Yeah.
So beyond the technologies, because there's other companies that maybe they have state-of-the-art technologies, but maybe the culture is not right.
I can tell you that the technology at Zara is no better than anyone else's. It's not super good. But they've gone beyond that, as you say. And just to give you an idea, and we're talking about little things like Zara, I think, were the first people who took that that security device that goes on garments that you see when you take it off in the
tag,
shop.
yeah.
And that's made by Tyco. And what they did, they went to Tyco and said, look, would it be possible to put some sort of a sensor in there so we can track these goods? So they actually made it not just a security device, but a tracking device. Mm. And so they were able to track, particularly when they bought about 50% of their product is bought made. The other 50 or 60% is made up by them or small cottage industries. The point is, they could these devices allowed them to track them. When I was in La Coruna, they took me to the township, and they had about 7 different stores there for each of their major brands, and they showed me sales attendants walking around with little two-way radios. So they could communicate with each other if someone came into the store. I'm thinking here about small innovations, but they'd been dreamed up by the people in the business. And every day they were thinking continuous improvement. What's my innovation? How can I innovate? And with that sort of depth and breadth of horsepower, you're going to get some great results. You're going to get a few failures as well, but who cares?
Yes, overall, who cares? Exactly. And just to come back a little bit to the point, because we had Dr. Rajiv, so he's a professor actually at the SP Jain School of Management here in Singapore.
I met.
It's a very very good course, of course. And he brought also the point, just in terms of prioritization, because we will have to talk a little bit, and a lot of people are into technologies, and typically every company has limitations. You cannot invest in all technologies at the same time because nobody has that much money or time.
Yep.
How should organizations prioritize the areas of their investment to counter the volatility?
Right. Well, look, you do need. I mean, these days, even SAP, which was the sort of the patron saint of the ERP system, along with Oracle, they came out with this sort of transactional systems. But the trouble with those were that they had no real decision-making capability. They were just transactional. What we need, I think you still need transactional systems that can cope with big volumes of data. And you're going to need this, particularly now if you have an Internet of Things strategies we talked about. But if you do the segmentation right and you understand that some of your customers are collaborative, then what you do is on top of your transactional system, you put a CRM. And the CRM sits on top and interfaces with it, and it allows you to manage those 100 or 50 or 10 collaborative customers in a very systematic way, and don't forget about them, right? And then over here, where you've got the agile, you might put something like Demantra or some software that's very much designed to handle agility for those customers that are always predominantly in an agile state of mind. And you also would load up freestanding software network optimization models that you would use at the strategic level when you're revamping your network every 5 years, or use it at the technical level where if a customer asks you to do something and you're not too sure whether you've got the capacity to do it, you can run a new scenario.
Yes.
So it's a horses for courses thing, and I think I think a lot of these new event tools that have been, and I'm not familiar with every one of them, coming out are like middleware that you can sit on top of your underlying base load transactional software and start to use it to virtually help you in your decision making, but more importantly, help you make fast decisions.
Yes. Susan Jacob had a question, and I think this is something on everybody's lips these days. Blockchain, and
Yep.
we have a couple of very good case studies already. Walmart, Maersk have done a team up with IBM to recreate supply chains using blockchain. What do you think is the future of a supply chain with blockchain? Taking into considerations, of course, there's going to be learning curves, there's going to be governments getting involved, regulations, and all of that.
Look, the blockchain is built on a technology the same as a cryptocurrency, and that's how I think banks first sort of saw it. Of course, if you look around the world, the people who are doing far more experimentation right now are the big banks, because if blockchain fulfills the type of dimensions and scope that we think it's going to do, it could disintermediate the banks and remove them from their very profitable business of letters of credit and acting as an intermediary between them. But having said all that, look, I think as someone said at the conference this morning, we've got to get our digitisation right first, because blockchain can't really work unless it's got a complete digitised picture and connecting all the different players along a particular supply chain, right from the supplier, the third parties, customs, and eventually the owners. But I think it's going to happen, and I think the great advantage is and when the protocols get worked out, and it might be a couple more years, and we need that time to get digitisation properly, in place anyhow. I think we're going to see tremendous efficiencies. I mentioned again at the Logisim conference this morning where it could just remove a huge amount of paperwork if all the parties are privy to a change in arrangement or a contract or something, and they agree with it. That's it, and there's no need, there's no need for paper. Yes. And so in that sense, it also has a security dimension. But I think probably for me, most importantly, it's the provenance that it will offer. The methodology of a blockchain where you're linking various blocks in a digital ledger with all the players visible and seeing what's changing and agreeing to those changes is going to mean that products, again, it's something that you sell, say if you sell some beef grown in Western Australia, and we know where the animal came from because it had an ear tag, and then it was processed, and that meat had a particular DNA, and that DNA was built into the blockchain, and it was ultimately then sold through distributors and retailers and eventually to the consumer in China. That retailer could say hand on heart that particular meat has come from a particular animal.
Traceability would be very
grass-fed from Western Australia. It has not been substituted. So I think it's going to be very powerful for things like food and food security, for wine, meat. And I'm looking forward to that. I think that the ability to offer that sort of credibility and accreditation is going to be the biggest thing, apart from all the efficiencies that I think it's going to bring.
Yes.
So it's going to happen. There's still protocols to work out. We're still in the experimental stage, but judging by how much effort each of the big banks are putting into this, there's definitely something involved here, and they're striving very hard to keep some part of the supply chain to themselves, and they might be intermediated out.
Yes, and then they might need to tweak the model a little bit, but for sure they're very concerned. So they cannot not invest in basically in this in blockchain.
Exactly,
and banks are at the forefront of this. And also, I remember that I was reading in terms of traceability and proof of origin. I was reading that Walmart, when they did the pilot with IBM, a very specific example for mangoes, it would take them 5 days before blockchain technology to trace that mango to where did it come from.
Yes.
And with blockchain, it took them 1.2 seconds.
There we go.
So, I think it's a no-brainer.
It's going to become a great marketing tool. I know a couple of years ago I was asked, BASF were being asked the question by Unilever, who in turn were being asked the question by their consumers about the labels on their products, because just about every food product has palm oil in it. And the question was being asked by people who are worried about sustainability, where does that palm oil coming from? Is it coming off old pastures or old forests that have been cleared, or new forests that have been cleared? And of course, in a homogeneous type product like that, which all goes into a tank, you can't actually put hand on heart and say, well, I know where it came from and I can trace it. With blockchain, it will be possible.
Yes. Talk about digitalization. So Sam Loke is asking, so definitely digitalization is shaping and will reshape the landscape where communication ITs are concerned. But how do you see the physical movement part? How will that change? How will that cope to better, I don't know, is better inventory? Is BTO the answer?
Look, I think what's going to happen with, and we've seen it in a way with our work with Schneider Electric and with some of the other companies we've worked with, that the big gains come from once you know what what your network is being asked to serve in terms of the marketplace and the differential ways that the customers want to be serviced, and you look back and you review your network, what you find is that it's not always about closing DCs or whatever, but it could mean retasking things. So, for instance, you might, if you've got a 30 or 40,000 SKU, instead of carrying those 30 or 40,000 SKUs in each of your DCs in a country or in a region, you might look at using Pareto and looking at the buying behaviours. Only the top 10% might need to be close to the marketplace in a smaller DC, and you might take all the rest and put them in an agile DC some distance away and use faster transport in the catch-up phase. So yeah, I think it's really redesigning the facilities and the structures and where those facilities are receiving their products from, which manufacturing plants, and which products are actually stored in each of those facilities. And so it's not a matter of more inventory, it's a matter of actually having the appropriate inventory in each of the facilities. Yes. and not having everything. Because the big cost is carrying a full range, and secondly, having so much of that range not moving. So you'll find some of it won't even move once in a year, whereas others will move 12, 15 times in a year in an industrial product. So we did some work. The work we did in China for Schneider Electric, it wasn't, the emphasis there wasn't on cost, because the cost to serve was quite good, but what the Chinese president was wanting was, can we only have something like 30 or 40%, I think, of our customers are getting next day delivery. What can we do to our network to stock things differently in different places? And what we did the work, and by using virtually the same facilities but retasking them, we doubled the number of their customers. I think it went to 76% of their customers were getting next day delivery, but on the same footprint, but just by being cleverer about which products were being stored.
Allocation, basically smart allocation.
Yeah, clever things to do, yeah.
Christian Go is asking, what's the essence of the term supply chain resilience for a third-party logistics? So he works for a 3PL. How does a 3PL become more resilient?
Look, 3PLs are in a very difficult position. They act, if you think about it, as a switching mechanism between their client and their client's customers. And so what it means is when they look forward to their clients' customers, they have to understand the buying behaviours. They have to understand the expectations of those customers. But when they look back towards their client, who's paying them the money to do the work and be an extension, they have to be able to, if you like, align with the internal strategies of that company. And that may be quite different. So to give you an idea, when they look back, they may have to have more of a collaborative culture and collaborate with the management and listen to them and try and meet their expectations. But when they look forward to that client's customers in the marketplace, they may have to have collaborative strategies, lean strategies, agile strategies, project strategies, and all the rest. So it's the task is to build an organisation structure that is even more resilient than a typical single company, because they're dealing with multiple clients and they've got multiple clients, customers, etc. So there's no secret about it. I think they've got to see themselves as a switching mechanism, and they've got to look at an organisation structure that will allow them to align backwards and forwards. And they've got to, I think, have very, very high quality people to do this, and people who can almost multitask. So I may
switch their hats.
Yeah, switch their hat. I mean, even though, let's say I'm very much a collaborative person, in one situation that works well if I'm working on that. But if I'm also having to deal with a customer over here who's agile and demanding, I've got to switch my mindset, even though it's not something I do naturally. You know what I mean? So people in 3PLs have got to be able to switch their mindsets away from their natural mindset and switch it back and forth and do it without becoming too stressed, because that's that multidisciplinary thing. You can't have dedicated teams on every client unless they're very big.
Yes.
I think the problem has been, if I'd be so brutal to say, that in many 3PLs, they grew up from transport companies and very much an operational mindset, and where they were just consumed with operations and pricing and process. And that really, it's only in the recent 5 years or so that some of the bigger ones now have started to recognise they need very much more higher quality executives.
Solution focus.
Yeah, because you need quality people in there that can mix and match with the top people on both the client side and on the client's customer side.
Yes.
No easy fixes there. And while this is all happening, the numbers of 3PLs around the world are being rationalised, and I think we're going to see a much big decrease in 3PLs, but except maybe in some places like China where you'll always have the locals. But in those cases, even you need the big multinationals to be able to link with those national carriers to get the last mile.
Yes.
And that needs technology, but it also needs cultural fit.
Yes. And I mean, it's. I think that you're right, and you're brutally honest, and I think it's fair that 3PLs are in a difficult position right now, and almost the question becomes, what do you think that the role will be in I don't know, in 5 to 10 years? Because as you said, right, from that operations mindset which they mostly grew up with to now solution focused. Let's see how can we address and build solutions to our clients. It's not an easy transition necessarily.
No, I mean, again, it's too much of it is just changing the word. Now we're in the solutions business, but it's easy to say, but what it does mean is you and I know they don't do it very well. What it means is you're theoretically getting to know the customer's expectations, and yet they're not. They're still guessing, and yet they're saying they're in the solutions business. So I think that they really got to go back to scratch, and the better 3PLs, and I can think of some of the bigger ones, have got the capacity and the quality of personnel now to start really doing it right. And the operational bit really will become the easiest bit.
Yes. And actually, there's an interesting question from Mick Jones, and he's head of logistics here for DS Smith, and he was saying, what's your view in terms of the structure of the industry going forward? Because we see a lot of evolution of this Uber type of organizations in road transport, in digital freight, like containers, like freighters, like all these platforms that are fundamentally changing the industry structure. Actually, he was giving the example of the holiday industry, which transformed basically in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
How do you think it will change the?
Look, I think the biggest change in many ways will be the digitization change and the development of sensors, which will be self-informing, self-reporting, which won't require going through gates or having expensive equipment. They'll just be, connected by GPS, etc. And those sensors are just about here, and the cost of them will be low. And then once someone knows where their product is, down to that product, not just to the case level, but to the product level within the case, and the case on the pallet, and the pallet within the container, I think pretty much everything else is not on. I mean, after that, if you're lucky enough to have an Uber truck to run you from A to B, and it might be fine. But I don't think that's where the big costs are. It's the costs that come from damage to your product and not knowing about it. It can come from leakage through stealing your product. There's a whole range of different things that can happen to your product, which in improved digitization and ultimately blockchain will virtually stop all that. And that's where the big gains will be. And, a bit of Uberization around transportation will be nice, and that'll have to be properly regulated. But we want to know where the product is, whether it's on an Uber truck or a TNT truck, doesn't matter.
You need to be able to trace it properly.
Yeah.
He also had a question about data. So data is key to us all and is our unique IP, right? So as a shipper, should we be insourcing data and outsourcing transactional processes? And if so, does that mean the end of, the provider-driven 4PL solutions, or, the development of internal shippers for PLs?
Yeah. Well, we talked earlier about the so-called provider-driven 4PL. A real 4PL is not a provider-driven 4PL. That's a 3.5 PL where they just add a few extra services. The proper 4PL, in my definition, was very much having a consortium. But when it comes to data, I think here, as I mentioned this morning in my speech, that I see a great opportunity. First of all, never sort of give your data away. The more data about our business and our industry and the things that affect our industry that we can bring in, and I'm suggesting we have an intermediary type of style of thing where, like a lead box, where you bring data in, you analyse it, you aggregate it, and you ship the aggregated data out to the partners who are part of this intermediary, plus their own data, so they can look at it, but they don't get competitors' data. I think we've got to start doing more industry-level data collection and using confidential methodologies to handle that data so that you don't undermine the competitiveness between the players. But at the same time, we want all players in an industry to benefit from raising the bar and having a better view of the aggregate data and compared to their individual. Yes. So I think that's the future going forward. It's going to require slightly different organisation design to get people together to trust an individual. We've got it. I mean, just to give you an example, in Australia we have one example of this. It's called Cash Services Australia, and it was set up by 4 banks in Australia, which are all competitors, and the Reserve Bank, and it was under the auspices of the Australian Anti-Competition Commission. And the whole idea was that moving cash around the economy every night, it's collected by armoured cars, it's taken to a point, it's resorted, it's put out again to ATMs and so on. And there was a lot of logistics costs being incurred by 4 or 5 armoured car companies going to the same location. So what they did is they made this company and put it together, and one armoured car company would do all the ATMs in an area and bring the cash back. Another one would do all the shopping centres, and it took a huge amount of logistics cost out, which benefited the whole industry. Mm-hmm. And the information about what was going on was only shared with individuals in terms of how much of their own cash was moving compared to the aggregate, so they could measure the percentages. I think, broadly speaking, it also helped the Reserve Bank of Australia understand what was happening in the economy.
Yes. And then when wrong, the question looping a little bit again on blockchain, with so many players coming up with their own blockchain, with their own currencies or tokens, yep. Do you see the possibility of a true total connected blockchain network happening, or how would you see it?
Look, it might be like AVs. Back in the 70s and 80s, we had 2 or 3 systems. We had, I can't remember the names of them now, but we had the Japanese version, and we had another version, and eventually one version, won out over the other. This was on CD, not CDs, on it wasn't. It was even before then. No. You probably weren't even born. It had tapes. They were just on tapes. I think, as I said earlier, blockchain is definitely coming. It's got enough advantages to keep everyone interested. It's just a matter of which protocol will finally be the one that's selected by the majority. Yes. Let's hope it gets down to one, because we don't want to be running dual systems. That's going to undermine a lot of the benefits. Yes. But it's coming, and
typically the market at the end chooses one.
It chooses one, and that's
for convenience.
Yeah, that's what will happen. Yeah.
What do you think is the future supply chain target operating model? I think you've touched upon it, but I think when Ron is asking, will there be best-in-class models for different industries, or will the future target operating model be standardized?
No, I don't think. I don't like the word standardized, unless standardized means that we're going to have a menu of technologies and processes and organisation designs, all pretty standard, and in different industries will have slightly different combinations of these. So I'm looking at creating unique solutions from different combinations of standard ways of doing things. That's the way I think the world's going to go. I don't think we're going to see, each industry, or because I said earlier, this is a common language, this logistics thing. You're moving a product. It doesn't know whether it's bananas or gold bars.
Yes.
Yes, there's some things that go on around on weights and measures which are important, but broadly speaking, it's a common language, and we ought to be selecting from a menu and coming up with the best combination or most appropriate combination for our industry or our particular company.
Another key buzzword, right? AI, artificial intelligence, related technologies at a faster pace than ever before. We're seeing it. It's not new, but now it seems to be blowing up out of proportion. There are several reports on possible huge talent crunch in coming years. Do you think it's really true? And what would be your advice to organizations to ensure the employees are ready for the impact of Industrial 4.0?
Look, again, we're here mainly talking about inside the manufacturing plant and inside the distribution centre. I'm not so much thinking that autonomous trucks are going to be arriving on a large scale. But again, if you look at the idea of, a base load of your business is pretty predictable because it's coming from customers that then AI would work very well there, where it's machine-driven, robot-driven, and there's not a lot of variation that the robot has to worry about. But I think on top of that, where we've got a lot of volatility in different parts of our business, we're still going to need human intervention, albeit with some help from technologies to manage that volatility, but it's not going to be straight AI just yet.
No.
I think the solutions in all these cases are what I call hybrid solutions. It's a mixture of the robot and the human and the combinations. And to give you an example, I saw a very clever innovation at the new Kuehne+Nagel Innovation Centre in Singapore a month or so ago when I was here. And it was around picking, and it was a sort of like a mule, little robot, like with a tray, and the robot was like a dog, and it recognised the picker, and it would follow the picker everywhere, and the picker would just do the picking and then at some point it would press a button, and the mule would go back to a central location, assembly point, and someone back there would unload it and put the product in a certain location to be put on a truck, and then the mule would come on back. So little things like that. They're early days. There was another example I saw there where a guy working in the warehouse wore a special AI type of vest, and the people in the control room could see where he was. They could direct him. It was for health and safety reasons as well. Some labour people may not like it, but it's coming, and it's, if something or an accident happens, we know where that individual is. So there's a lot of things, a lot of technological devices that are going to be there to help man do a better job, but we're still going to need men as well.
Yes.
Men and women.
Dot Cool is asking, when you go into a business for the first time to consult on new strategies, it's a different type to ask the question. Is what are some of the resistance that you come across?
Look, the biggest problem when we go inside companies is what I call the myths that exist. And the bigger the dog you are, the bigger your myth, and the more say you have. There's a lot of opinion. And people sort of sometimes say to me in desperation, what can we do to break that, because the boss thinks this way or that way. And I say simply, look, do the segmentation work, do the behavioural work. The methodology is qualitative and quantitative, and it's fact-based. And if it's presented well, it's irrefutable. I mean, once you explain to someone what the structure of their market is for their particular product, they can dislike it.
Yes.
They can, try to deny it, but in fact, because it's fact and it's coming from the customer, it's irrefutable.
Yes.
And that's the way to say, right, Okay, I accept that. I didn't think that was the case. Okay, that's what the customers are saying. Okay, I'll agree to your suggestion about the way you want to re-engineer the inside of the business to match with that.
Yes.
That's the only way to do it, because otherwise you're up against your opinion versus my opinion, and
it's a never-ending debate.
It's a never-ending debate. You can't win that.
Yes.
If you're a middle manager.
And moving on to the people segment, right? Because I think it also the two key aspects of Gattorna Dynamic Alignment are culture and leadership, right? Yep. So it's on the soft skill side.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit in terms of each of them. How can an organization shape the culture to achieve high performance in their supply chains?
Well, high performance, can be measured in different ways, and that's one of the problems, that people have different KPIs. What I like to make the distinction, if you like, between the supply chain function as a function that runs the physical side of the business and picks up product from manufacturing and stores it and delivers it, and make that distinction between what I call the supply chain philosophy, which should be embraced by everyone: sales, marketing, procurement, finance. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we're managing our businesses vertically, but our customers are buying horizontally, and this is a flaw. And we've got to finally get rid of this flaw, because at the moment, what's caught up with us is the speed with which customers' expectations have increased with the coming of e-commerce. 30, 40 years ago, someone would order something and be happy to take a week or 7 days or 10 days or 2 weeks. Now they want it in 1 day. And even if we could give it to them in 1 day, we don't have the structure to do it, because the people who are managing vertically and thinking about their budgets are then asked in the same breath to think horizontally, and how are we going to get that delivered?
It's impossible.
It's impossible to do it. And companies like, here in Asia Pacific, Li and Fung, around the world, Adidas, so Zara, a number of companies now are experimenting with the idea of keeping your vertical specialisms in place, because you need those, but actually seconding people out of them and putting them over here and forming teams which drive the horizontal flow. So this is not matrix management. This is you've actually got two levels of management: one vertical, one horizontal, and they're in sync.
Yes.
And the guys who are seconded into those clusters are managed by a different person, have different joint KPIs, and then after 2 years they go back into their function. So you're moving people around, you're giving them a much greater, more interesting career path. And I think that's what you're going to have to do to actually decrease the lead time and get anywhere near what the expectations are of today's consumer.
Yes, so it's almost like building a culture of openness and collaboration insteid of siloed. I mean, breaking through the walls, right?
That's right. And the great thing, if you take a manufacturing person out of manufacturing and put them in a multidisciplinary team that's got a KPI that's very focused on the customer, if there's a problem in manufacturing, that person will have an informal link to this person in manufacturing. They'll sort it out. Whereas in today's structure, they've got to go up the function, across and down, and it's the biggest problem today in lead time blowouts is inside the business, in orders being processed too slowly.
It's bureaucracy, basically.
Yeah, it's credit checking that takes 2 weeks instead of 1 minute. That sort of stuff.
Yes.
All of that is eating into the lead time. Now, if you can kill all that and just compress it all, and start doing some clever things in manufacturing like postponement, you can actually get your lead times down to hours, if not a few days.
Yes. And how about leadership, John? I mean, that's key, right?
That drives it all.
That drives it all, right?
If you don't have a leader or leaders who've got this sort of architectural mind, who can look at the marketplace and say, yep, for our sort of product, we really need to speed up the organisation, or we need to 60% of our customers will take the standard, that's fine, 7 days, but there's another 40 who happen to be the growing part of our market that we've got to do better. Unless you've got a leadership team who really understands that and then starts to put strategies and build subcultures and organisation designs to deliver those strategies, you're never going to make it. Because if the leaders don't believe in it, or worse still, if they're disconnected, I think a lot of the pharmaceutical companies are like that. They grew fat on fat margins. They come off patent. Suddenly, supply chain is important. They start listening to everyone. They get confused. They don't know what to do. I see a lot of that. So, the best people in the world, in my view, in supply chain are those who are under the pump all the time.
Yes.
People like Apple, who, their product is wanted. You go to buy an Apple product, you want it. It's got to be there. And so if you reverse back from there, what has to happen in the pipeline from manufacturing through to the retail store to get that product so that it's there when you want it? Those people who are under the pump, because it's a fashion item, and fashion tends to be the thing that's under the pump most, they're the best supply chain companies in the world, you'll find.
Yes. And then we actually, companies call upon us, and that's the business of Morgan Phillips, right, in terms of hiring people, in terms of placing senior executives. But a lot of times it boils down to a few key attributes, right? And it actually a lot of times it's not the technical side, especially when you're talking about a chief supply chain officer, when you're talking about a vice president for supply chain for a region. It's the soft skills, right? So in your view, and going a little bit deeper, right, into leadership and what it means and all that, what's some of the three attributes, let's say, of a chief supply chain officer?
Look, I think a chief supply chain officer has really got to be, in a sense, like a general manager. He needs to have done an MBA. He may have come out of, he may be an engineer by first degree, but he's gone back, he's done his MBA, he's picked up skills in finance, he's picked up skills in strategy and HR. He's got to be, I think, an overall manager, and he's got to be able to manage people with different mindsets, because in a leadership team, you want people who have empathy with customers and particularly collaborative customers. So they've got to be able to build a collaborative cluster of people and shape it like a coach does a football team or a sporting team. You want someone also in your team who's very cost conscious and is always worried about cost, and because we'll put him in charge of the lean team. We want someone in there who's young and impatient and wants to make quick decisions, and he's the guy that will take risk and he looks after the agile team. And we've got people who we go to when we're looking for a major new solution to a major disruption or disaster. And the chief supply chain officer has got to be able to manage basically what's oil and water. They'll be competing against each other. They'll be competing with each other for resources, but they're all needed because their individual mindsets are needed because we have customers like that. Yes. So I think the chief supply chain officer in many ways is the CEO of the biggest part of the company, which very mostly is procurement, manufacturing, and logistics. And about the only thing he doesn't really do is manage the brand, sales and marketing, but he should have a strong relationship with those people, and he certainly should be on the main board.
Yes. And that brings me to the point, right? Because in reality, and it's a question that we need to put it brutally on the table, in reality, some companies, in some organizations, actually, supply chain still doesn't actually have a seat at the table.
No.
Why is that? I mean, why?
I think it's because they're in denial. They haven't understood that they're a supply chain company. I mean, no one makes any money unless someone sells something and someone delivers it, right? And we need people who can sell, and we need people who can deliver. And for many years, retailers were a bit like that. They thought they were traders. So most retailers, like the early days of Tesco in the UK, they had very clever people who were good at buying and selling. They were like traders. They never thought about the third leg, which is that as they became more sophisticated, they realised they've got to buy well, they've got to bring the product in, they've got to put it on the shelf, so you need good merchandising, but you've got to get the product in on time, and you've got to factor that in. And it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that, the global retailers have realised that you need people who are good merchandising and buyers, you need people who are good store managers, and the third leg of the stool is logistics.
Yes.
And so they've realised it, but there's still companies out there who are manufacturing who think they make a good product and it'll sell itself. I'm sorry, there's too much competition out there now. So I think the first thing is the realisation that supply chain and logistics within it is a very, very, very important equal part of everything we do, and we should have that represented on the board.
Yes. And I mean, I think there's more and more encouraging examples, right? I think let's just take Unilever. I mean, you mentioned you've done a lot of work. Pierluigi Sigismondi, who used to be the chief supply chain officer of Unilever, he made the transition now into. He's now the president of Southeast Asia and Australia. He's an excellent example of somebody that had a lot of exposure to supply chain and then made the transition to P&L, which kind of exactly what you said, right? Because he's like a general manager. He then moved to a full.
It was a natural transition for him, and all he has to learn now is about the brand and so on. But fascinatingly, we did a lot of work in Asia here for Ralph Lauren, and the chief supply chain officer there was a young Brit, actually, although it's based in New York. And we did quite a lot of work looking at the way they collected all their product from manufacturers and brought it into Hong Kong and shipped it to Greensboro in the US and then distributed. And what impressed me most about this guy was that you could ask him any question about the brands, about the product. He knew it all. Right?
Yeah.
He was the chief supply chain officer, but he also understood the product.
Yes.
And I think that's the new breed of, because then they easily can step up. And he's now president of Ralph Lauren in Japan. So it's an easy step up for them to, if you have that sort of
And
depth.
it's critical because otherwise the business will not give you the credibility.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
We're moving to the final segment. Just a few questions on the personal side, John. Obviously, you're a person that has achieved a lot in your life. Are there some leadership principles that you follow in your day-to-day work?
Look, yes, I think my day-to-day, and I've always been like this, is that I get up in the morning, I think about what I've got to do today, and I attack it with enthusiasm. But most importantly, I look to try and learn something new every day. That is my principle. That I've got to learn something new every day. And that's why from time to time, if I'm not speaking at a conference, I'll go to a conference and listen to what people are saying. And, even I'm someone who's supposed to be advising people, but even we have got to, put ourselves in positions where we continue our learning. So I think if you stop learning, you die. Mm-hmm. And that's the principle I live on. And more importantly, I think, or most importantly, in this field, you have to be very eclectic. You have to be prepared to take information in from all sorts of different places and join the dots. And I spent my life trying to join the dots and make something out of nothing, as it were, and take common things and turn them into something which are extraordinary. So that's really the main thing I look at.
Got it. And in your career, actually, you made the switch, right? You made the switch from you worked at Accenture, you were in academia, you became a global figure and recognized thought leader. How did you manage to do that? What were some of your key learnings?
Look, it evolves. I think one of the things I learned a long time ago, and I once heard the Vice Chancellor of Sydney University make the same point when she was addressing a bunch of boys in high school and saying, look, when you go through life, when you get presented with an opportunity, you grab it and you go with it, right? You don't sit back and say, well, I'll wait, I think, another year or a week because there may be a better opportunity come along, I know people like that, and they go nowhere because they never make a decision about anything. So I've always been someone, so when I started engineering, after several years, I got a bit tired of it. I tried a few American companies and different parts of engineering, oil fields and hydraulics, still didn't get it. At the same time, I was doing my MBA and I was introduced to the early days of distribution management and logistics by a Canadian professor. I got really interested in it, decided I would, jump into that field, but not go to the bottom again and work my way up because I was 32 at that stage. So I looked around the world and decided to go to Cranfield because it had a very good industry background and, people like Rolls-Royce and others were involved, and do my PhD and sort of leapfrog. And I did that, and after 3 years I got my PhD. I did a bit of teaching, and then I was invited to spend a year at Oxford, but didn't really like the Oxford sort of life. And so then we decided to go back to Australia because we had a small family. And when I got back there, life was good in the early 80s, but there was no theory, no concepts, no nothing. And that's when I decided to grab everything by the the horns and try to start making some theories and concepts that we could use as frameworks to filter things going forward and leave it as a bit of a legacy. So in all parts of my life, there's been some changes, but these have been opportunities that have been presented to me, and I've taken them. And
yes.
My wife would argue I've made too many changes, and that I'm too obsessive now about this field. But I think, like any athlete or world champion, you have to be obsessive about if you want to be the best.
Yes. And you might have answered it with the first question, but any other personal habit that contributes to your success apart from the fact that you're constantly wanting to learn something every day?
No, I think the learning thing is the big thing, and why I really because all the other things you can get. I've got young analysts who work for me who do clever stuff, and then I can look at. I don't have to be able to do my own PowerPoint, although I can do a bit. You don't have to do a lot of those basics. I think it's just the mindset that you've always got your mind open. You're always looking. Your imagination. The first chapter of my PhD was about innovation, and I surveyed all the literature, reviewed all the literature in innovation. It took me a year because there was so much written about innovation, and a lot of it's misunderstood and difficult to apply. So I just think that you've got to go where the opportunities present, keep an open mind, have a learning mindset, and finally, as a side sort of bar to that, try to bring along young people. And, I've had young analysts join me from all over the world, from Germany. We've got one from Germany at the moment. And we'll keep her for 3 or 4 years, and then she'll launch out and she'll be a brilliant executive in a company. We've had them from Holland, from Vietnam, and I help them with education and get into university and do MBAs and stuff like that. So I believe that you've got to do a bit of giving back as well, and breed this new breed, because supply chain people are not born. They come from different backgrounds, and you've got to shape them.
Yes.
Yep.
And if you could give some advice to a young graduate of a university wanting to achieve a great career in supply chain, maybe become the chief supply chain officer of a manufacturing company, what would it be?
Look, what I'd be saying is, I don't care what your undergraduate degree is. It could be in arts. It doesn't matter, just as long as you're a good thinker. Once you've done your undergraduate, go out, work in industry for 4 or 5 years, so you start to understand the way the world works, warts and all. Then go back and do an MBA or an MSc in logistics at a good university like Cranfield, where they have 1-year type MScs. And I've certainly helped a lot of people get into those places. And then come out now really with all the theory and a bit of practical knowledge, and you interview a number of companies, not they interview you. You look around and try and find a company that seems to have a top executive that seems to be going in the direction that you'd like the company. It's no use joining companies where you get frustrated. And I've seen even people here today who are frustrated with their companies because they know what they want to do, but they leave, and then they get very down on themselves. So the last thing is, you do the interviewing, you select the company, you look at it, and you may get a few wrong, but you'll get it right in the end. So and it has to be a place where you can practice your imagination and bring some real value in terms of the supply chain design and operation.
Yes. John, thank you very much. It's been a very insightful sharing. My pleasure to have you with us today, and thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure, Radu, and all the best.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to follow us on radupalamario.com/podcast for all the show notes, links, and extra tips covered in the interview. Make sure also to subscribe to our emailing list to get the news in the nick of time. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes or Stitcher and you like what we do, please kindly review and give us 5 stars so we can keep the energy flowing and get more people to find out about our podcast. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me to stay tuned for our latest articles as well as future guests for the podcast. And if you have any suggestions or any other idea, please feel free to write to me. I respond to all. And also, please make sure not to miss our next episode, where we will be having a few other C-level and top leaders in supply chain joining us. Stay tuned.